My parents sat in my living room, explaining why they desperately needed me to add them to my health insurance plan, completely unaware that I was the same daughter they had abandoned during my cancer surgery because it conflicted with my brother's wedding date. 3 months later, they discovered I was now the head of oncology at the hospital where they needed treatment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Presbyterian Medical Center, casting a warm glow across the mahogany desk that had become my sanctuary over the past 2 years. The walls were lined with medical journals, patient thank you cards, and the diplomas that represented 15 years of relentless dedication to oncology. My white coat hung on its designated hook, the embroidered Dr. Chen, head of oncology, still feeling surreal even after 8 months in this position. I adjusted the stethoscope around my neck and reviewed the morning schedule on my tablet. 23 patients today, ranging from routine follow-ups to complex treatment consultations. Each name represented a story, a family, a battle that I understood more intimately than most physicians ever could. The scar running along my left breast, hidden beneath my professional attire, served as a constant reminder of why I had chosen this specialty, why I fought so fiercely for every patient who walked through these doors. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now held one of the most prestigious positions in cancer care at the very hospital where I had received my own treatment 3 years ago. Back then, I had been Dr. Chen, research fellow, fighting for my life while my family fought over wedding seating arrangements. Now I was Dr. Chen, department head, with the power to approve or deny treatment protocols, insurance authorizations, and physician referrals. My assistant, Rebecca, knocked softly on the door before entering with her usual morning efficiency. "Dr. Chen, your 9 o'clock consultation is here early. The Morrison family for the pancreatic cancer case. Also, there's been a request for an emergency consultation this afternoon, something about a complicated insurance approval situation." I nodded, setting aside my tablet and reaching for the Morrison file. Pancreatic cancer was one of the most aggressive forms of the disease, and I knew from experience that families facing this diagnosis needed not just medical expertise, but emotional support and clear communication about the difficult road ahead. The morning progressed with its usual intensity. Mrs. Morrison, a 72-year-old retired teacher, sat between her husband and daughter as I explained the treatment options available to her. Her case was caught early enough for surgical intervention, but the chemotherapy protocol would be aggressive and demanding. "Doctor," her daughter asked, her voice trembling slightly, "will she be able to attend my wedding in December? It's been planned for 2 years, and it would mean everything to have her there." The question hit me with unexpected force, transporting me back to a conversation I had tried to forget. I took a measured breath before responding, my professional training overriding the personal memories that threatened to surface. "Mrs. Morrison's treatment timeline will put her in the middle of chemotherapy during December," I explained gently. "However, if we can coordinate with your wedding date, there might be a window during her treatment cycle when she could attend, even if briefly. The important thing is that we don't compromise her treatment schedule for social events, but we can certainly try to work around significant family moments when medically appropriate." Mrs. Morrison's eyes filled with tears of relief, and her daughter squeezed her hand tightly. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for understanding how important this is to our family." As I left my office, I found myself thinking about the stark difference in how families could respond to cancer diagnoses. Some rallied together, rearranging their entire lives to support their loved one. Others, like mine, saw the illness as an inconvenience that conflicted with their existing plans. The afternoon brought its usual parade of complex cases, insurance authorization battles, and treatment planning meetings. I had learned to compartmentalize my personal experiences, using them to fuel my advocacy for patients rather than allowing them to create emotional barriers. Every denied insurance claim I fought, every treatment protocol I approved, every family I counseled through impossible decisions, was infused with the memory of what it felt like to face cancer without family support. At 3:30, Rebecca appeared in my doorway again, her expression slightly puzzled. "Dr. Chen, that emergency consultation I mentioned this morning? The family is here, and they're specifically asking for you." They seem to think you can help them navigate some insurance complications for a cancer diagnosis. I glanced at my schedule, noting that I had blocked out time for administrative work. What type of cancer are we dealing with? Lung cancer, stage 3. The patient is a 58-year-old woman, and her husband is insisting that only the head of oncology can authorize the specific treatment protocol they want. They seem quite demanding, actually. They keep mentioning that they have connections and expect immediate attention. The description triggered a familiar unease, but I dismissed it as coincidence. Demanding family members were unfortunately common in oncology, often driven by fear and desperation rather than genuine entitlement. "Send them in," I said, straightening my coat and pulling up a new patient file on my computer. "And Rebecca, could you have someone bring them some water?" These conversations are never easy. I heard voices in the hallway, a man's voice speaking in the authoritative tone that usually indicated someone accustomed to getting their way through volume rather than reason. There was something familiar about the cadence, but I couldn't place it until Rebecca opened my door and announced, "Dr. Chen, this is Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They're here about Mrs. Thompson's recent diagnosis." The world seemed to stop as my parents walked into my office. My father, Richard Thompson, looked older than his 63 years. His once commanding presence diminished by worry and the weight of the last few months. My mother, Linda, appeared frail and tired, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman who had spent 3 years ago complaining about how my surgery was going to interfere with wedding planning. They didn't recognize me immediately. The years of medical training, the weight loss from my own cancer treatment, and the professional demeanor I had cultivated had transformed me from the desperate daughter they had abandoned into the composed physician sitting across from them. "Please, have a seat," I said, my voice steady and professional despite the earthquake occurring in my chest. I gestured to the chairs facing my desk, the same chairs where countless families had received life-changing news. My father settled into his chair with the same self-important air that had characterized my childhood, while my mother looked around the office with obvious anxiety. Neither of them had made the connection between Dr. Sarah Chen, head of oncology, and Sarah Thompson, the daughter whose cancer surgery they had skipped. "Doctor," my father began, his voice carrying the presumptuous tone I remembered from every family gathering. "We appreciate you making time for us on such short notice. We were told that you're the person who can authorize the treatment protocol my wife needs, and frankly, we've been getting the runaround from other physicians." I opened my laptop and created a new patient file, my fingers moving automatically across the keyboard, while my mind reeled from the surreal nature of the situation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Start with the basic information. "Mrs. Thompson, when were you diagnosed?" My mother's voice was smaller than I remembered, diminished by the fear that comes with hearing the word cancer applied to your own body. 6 weeks ago. Stage 3 lung cancer. They caught it during a routine scan, thank goodness. But the oncologist at our local hospital says I need a very specific type of treatment that's only available at major medical centers. The irony was suffocating. Here was my mother, the woman who had told me that my cancer surgery was inconveniently timed, and that surely I could reschedule it to avoid conflicting with my brother's wedding, now sitting in my office desperate for the same type of specialized cancer care she had minimized when I needed it. "I see," I said, making notes in her file while carefully controlling my expression. "And what specific treatment protocol are you hoping to pursue?" My father leaned forward, his voice taking on the demanding quality that had made my childhood feel like a series of negotiations I was destined to lose. "We want the best, doctor. Money is no object. We want the most aggressive treatment available, the latest innovations, the kind of care that only the top physicians provide." The statement hung in the air between us, and I felt the bitter taste of memory flooding my mouth. This was the same man who had told me that cancer treatment was expensive, and that perhaps I should consider less aggressive options to minimize the financial impact on the family, especially with my brother's wedding expenses mounting. "Treatment decisions should be based on medical appropriateness rather than cost," I replied carefully, my professional training warring with the personal hurt that threatened to overwhelm my composure. "Let me review your medical records and imaging results, and then we can discuss the options that would be most beneficial for your specific situation." My mother clutched her purse tightly, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Despite everything that had happened between us, seeing her afraid and vulnerable struck a chord of sympathy that I hadn't expected to feel. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I'm scared. I've never been sick like this before, and everything feels so overwhelming." The other physicians have been very clinical, very cold. We were hoping to find someone who would really fight for me, someone who understands how important it is to beat this thing. The irony was so complete, it was almost breathtaking. My mother was asking me to be the advocate she had never been for me, to fight the battle she had deemed inconvenient when it was mine to face. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice remaining professionally calm, "I want you to know that every patient who comes through this office receives my complete attention and advocacy. Cancer doesn't discriminate, and neither do I. Your fear is understandable, and we'll work together to develop a treatment plan that gives you the best possible outcome." My father's posture relaxed slightly, and I could see the relief in his eyes. He had clearly expected to have to negotiate or demand his way into receiving quality care, and my immediate commitment to advocacy seemed to surprise him. "Now that's what I'm talking about," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "We need someone who understands that this is a priority, that everything else takes a back seat to fighting this cancer. Family events, work commitments, social obligations, none of that matters when someone's life is on the line." The statement hit me like a physical blow. Here was my father, articulating perfectly the perspective I had desperately wanted him to have 3 years ago, when it was my life on the line and my brother's wedding that was taking priority. I took a careful breath before responding, my voice remaining steady despite the emotional upheaval occurring beneath my professional exterior. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Thompson. When someone is facing cancer, their treatment and recovery should be the primary focus for the entire family. Support systems are crucial for positive outcomes." My mother nodded, emphatically. "Exactly. That's why we've told everyone that everything revolves around my treatment now. David's vacation plans, family gatherings, everything gets scheduled around my chemo appointments and recovery periods." David. My brother. The golden child whose wedding had been deemed more important than my surgery. The brother who was now apparently being asked to rearrange his vacation plans for my mother's treatment, while 3 years ago I had been expected to reschedule major surgery to accommodate his wedding timeline. "Family support is indeed crucial," I agreed, making notes in her file while fighting to maintain my professional composure. "Patients with strong family support systems generally have better outcomes, both physically and emotionally." My father leaned back in his chair, a gesture that conveyed both relief and self-satisfaction. "We're a very close family, doctor. We take care of our own. Whatever Linda needs, whatever it costs, whatever sacrifices have to be made, we'll make them. That's what family does." The statement was so disconnected from my own experience with this family that I had to pause my typing to process the cognitive dissonance. This was the same man who had told me that my cancer treatment was financially irresponsible and emotionally selfish because it conflicted with family celebrations. "That's wonderful to hear," I managed, my voice remaining professionally neutral. "Now let's discuss the specifics of your case, Mrs. Thompson. The treatment protocol you'll need is indeed aggressive, and it will require a significant time commitment from both you and your support system." As I pulled up her medical records on my screen, I found myself studying my parents with the clinical detachment I had learned to apply to difficult cases. My mother looked genuinely frightened, a vulnerability I had rarely seen during my childhood. My father appeared determined and resolute, the same expression he had worn when explaining to me why my surgery needed to be postponed. "The good news," I continued, "is that your staging suggests we caught this early enough for treatment to be very effective. The challenging news is that the protocol will involve 6 months of chemotherapy, potential radiation therapy, and a recovery period that could extend well beyond that." My mother's face went pale. 6 months? But that would take us through the holidays, through David's promotion celebration, through life, I finished quietly. "Mrs. Thompson, cancer treatment doesn't pause for holidays or celebrations. The timeline is determined by medical necessity, not social convenience." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I wondered if he was remembering a similar conversation from 3 years ago, when I had tried to explain that my surgery date wasn't negotiable. "Of course," he said quickly, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "We understand that. We're just trying to wrap our heads around how this affects everything else." I found myself studying his face, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication that he remembered having this exact conversation with me when the roles were reversed. But there was nothing. To him, I was simply Dr. Chen, the specialist who would help his wife navigate her cancer treatment. "Mr. Thompson," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm curious about your family's experience with cancer. Have you dealt with this disease before? Sometimes previous experiences can help inform our approach to treatment and family support." The question was a test, and I watched carefully for their reactions. My mother looked confused while my father's expression remained blank. "No," my mother said slowly, "this is our first experience with cancer. We're learning everything as we go along." The denial was complete. In their minds, my cancer experience had been so minimized, so dismissed, that it didn't even register as a family experience with the disease. I had faced surgery, chemotherapy, and recovery entirely alone, while they focused on wedding planning, and apparently that experience was so insignificant that it didn't warrant mentioning to my current oncologist. "I see," I replied, making careful notes in her file. "Well, then let me share some insights about what you can expect, both medically and emotionally, as you navigate this journey." For the next 30 minutes, I provided them with the comprehensive consultation that I provided to all my patients. I explained the treatment timeline, the side effects they could expect, the importance of maintaining nutrition and emotional support, and the various resources available to help families cope with the challenges of cancer treatment. Throughout the consultation, I found myself giving them the care and attention I had desperately wanted 3 years ago. The irony was almost unbearable, but my professional training and personal ethics demanded that I provide the same level of care to every patient, regardless of my personal history with them. "Dr. Chen," my father said as our consultation began to wind down, "I have to say, your approach to patient care is exactly what we were hoping to find. You clearly understand that cancer affects the entire family, not just the patient." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral despite the bitter irony of his statement. "That's always been my philosophy, Mr. Thompson. Cancer is a family disease, and treatment is most successful when everyone works together to prioritize the patient's health and recovery." "Exactly," my mother said, her voice carrying relief and gratitude. "We've been so worried about finding a physician who would really understand our family dynamics and work with us to minimize the disruption to everyone's lives." The statement revealed everything about their approach to her diagnosis. Even now, facing her own cancer, my mother was primarily concerned with minimizing disruption to the family rather than maximizing her chances of survival. It was the same mindset that had led them to view my cancer as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. "Mrs. Thompson," I said carefully, "I want to be very clear about something. Successful cancer treatment requires that the patient's health becomes the family's primary priority. Everything else, holidays, celebrations, work commitments, social obligations, all of that becomes secondary to treatment and recovery." My father nodded vigorously, apparently oblivious to the contradiction between his current agreement and his past actions. "Absolutely, doctor. That's exactly how we see it. Linda's health is the most important thing, and everything else will just have to work around her treatment schedule." The statement was so perfectly ironic that I had to look down at my notes to hide my expression. This was the same man who had told me that my health would just have to work around my brother's wedding schedule. "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, my voice remaining professionally calm, "because I'll be very direct with you about something. If this family isn't prepared to make Mrs. Thompson's treatment the absolute priority, if there's any indication that social events or family obligations are taking precedence over medical care, then I would recommend finding another oncologist." The warning was delivered in my most professional tone, but it carried an edge that made both my parents sit up straighter. They had no way of knowing that my commitment to this principle was born from personal experience with what happened when families prioritized celebrations over cancer treatment. "Doctor," my father said quickly, his voice carrying a note of alarm, "please don't misunderstand. We're completely committed to Linda's treatment. Whatever it takes, Whatever sacrifices need to be made, we'll make them. I studied his face, looking for any sign of sincerity, any indication that he had learned something from his past behavior that he couldn't even remember. But all I saw was the same self-centered concern that had characterized his approach to my own diagnosis. I hope so, I said quietly, because cancer treatment isn't just about medical protocols and insurance authorizations. It's about surrounding the patient with unconditional support, regardless of how inconvenient the timing might be. My mother reached across the desk and touched my hand briefly, a gesture that sent an unexpected jolt of emotion through me. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Thank you for understanding how important this is to our family. The touch of her hand, the gratitude in her voice, the desperate hope in her eyes, all of it combined to create a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. This was my mother, asking for the compassion she had never shown me, seeking the advocacy she had never provided, requesting the family support she had never offered. Of course, I replied, gently withdrawing my hand and returning to my professional demeanor. Now let's discuss the practical aspects of your treatment. You'll need to be added to a comprehensive insurance plan that covers experimental protocols and extended care. Do you currently have coverage that includes those provisions? My father's expression darkened slightly. That's actually one of our biggest concerns, Doctor. Our current insurance plan doesn't cover the level of treatment Lyndon needs, and we're exploring options for upgrading our coverage or finding alternative funding sources. The insurance question opened up an entirely new dimension of irony. 3 years ago, my parents had encouraged me to choose less expensive treatment options to minimize the financial impact on the family budget. Now they were actively seeking ways to access the most expensive treatments available. I see, I said, pulling up information about insurance requirements on my computer. The treatment protocol we're discussing will likely cost several $100,000 over the course of 6 to 8 months. Most insurance plans require pre-authorization and have specific networks of approved providers. My mother's face went pale. Several $100,000? We had no idea it would be that expensive. The reaction was painfully familiar. I remembered having the same conversation with them 3 years ago, when they had been horrified by the cost of my treatment and had suggested that perhaps I could find less expensive alternatives. Cancer treatment is unfortunately very expensive, I explained patiently. However, most comprehensive insurance plans cover the majority of costs, especially when the treatment is medically necessary rather than experimental. My father leaned forward, his expression intense. What would you recommend, doctor? How do families usually handle this kind of financial burden? The question was loaded with implications, and I found myself wondering if they were hoping I would somehow provide free or discounted care, the same way they had expected me to absorb the financial burden of my own treatment without family support. Most families rely on insurance coverage, I replied carefully. Some also have supplemental policies or access to family resources that can help cover out-of-pocket expenses. The important thing is ensuring that financial concerns don't delay or compromise necessary treatment. What about family assistance? My mother asked quietly. If a family member had excellent insurance coverage, would it be possible for them to add relatives to their plan in emergency situations? The question hit me with stunning clarity. They were here not just seeking medical care but hoping to find a way to access better insurance coverage through family connections. The same family connections they had severed when I needed their support. That's certainly possible in some situations, I said slowly, my mind racing through the implications. Many employer-sponsored plans allow employees to add family members during special enrollment periods, especially in cases of medical emergency. My father's expression brightened considerably. That could be exactly what we need. We actually have a daughter who works in a medical field. She has excellent insurance coverage through her employer. Do you think she might be able to add us to her plan? The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular, that I had to grip the edge of my desk to maintain my composure. They were sitting in my office, asking for my medical expertise to save my mother's life, while simultaneously planning to ask me for insurance coverage, without having any idea that the daughter they were discussing and the doctor they were consulting were the same person. That would depend on several factors, I managed, my voice remaining steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring in my chest. The employee would need to be willing to add family members, the insurance plan would need to allow it, and there would be financial implications for everyone involved. "Oh, I'm sure she'd be willing," my mother said with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything by their children. "She's always been very responsible about family obligations. I'm sure once we explain the situation, she'll understand how important this is." The assumption that I would automatically comply with their request, after they had abandoned me during my own medical crisis, was breathtaking in its audacity. They had rejected my need for family support, but assumed I would provide financial support without question. "Family dynamics can be complicated," I said carefully, "especially when it comes to financial obligations and insurance coverage. The daughter you're referring to, how would you describe your relationship with her?" My parents exchanged glances, and I watched as they calculated how to present themselves in the most favorable light possible. "We're very close," my father said confidently. "She's always been a good daughter, very devoted to family. She went through a difficult period a few years ago, some health issues that made her a bit withdrawn, but she's doing much better now." The revision of history was stunning. My difficult period and health issues had been cancer, surgery, and chemotherapy that I had faced without their support. My withdrawal had been the natural result of their abandonment during the most challenging time of my life. "And during her health issues," I asked, my voice carefully neutral, "how did the family support her through that challenging time?" Again, my parents exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to remember their version of events in a way that painted them as supportive family members. "Well," my mother said slowly, "it was a very busy time for our family. David was getting married, and there were so many details to coordinate. Sarah understood that we couldn't drop everything, but we tried to be supportive in our own way." The euphemisms were remarkable. They had tried to be supportive in their own way by prioritizing my brother's wedding over my cancer surgery. I had understood that they couldn't drop everything because they had given me no choice but to understand. "I see," I replied, making notes in the file that had nothing to do with my mother's medical condition and everything to do with documenting the conversation that was revealing the true nature of my family's dynamics. "So you believe this daughter would be willing to take on the financial responsibility of adding you to her insurance plan, even given the complicated family history you've described?" My father waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, absolutely. Family is family, doctor. When someone really needs help, you put aside any petty disagreements and do what's right. She'll understand that this is a matter of life and death." The statement was so ironic, so completely disconnected from their actual behavior when I had needed help in a matter of life and death, that I had to look away to maintain my composure. "Family dynamics can be very complex," I said carefully, "especially when previous medical crises have tested those relationships. Has your daughter expressed any ongoing concerns about how her health issues were handled by the family?" My mother looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Not really. I mean, she's been a bit distant since then, but we assumed it was just because she was focused on her career. She's very ambitious, very driven. Sometimes she gets so caught up in work that she doesn't have much time for family." The characterization was perfect. In their minds, my absence from family gatherings wasn't due to their abandonment during my medical crisis, but rather to my career ambitions and work schedule. They had rewritten history to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the deterioration of our relationship. "Work can certainly be demanding," I agreed, thinking about the irony that my demanding work now included sitting in this office, providing medical care to the parents who had abandoned me during my own medical crisis. "But I'm sure once she understands how serious Linda's condition is," my father continued, "she'll make time to help. She works in healthcare herself, so she knows how important good insurance coverage is for cancer treatment." The assumption that I would drop everything to help them after they had refused to make any accommodations for my health crisis was stunning in its entitlement. They expected me to provide the family support they had never offered, the financial assistance they had never given, the prioritization of health over convenience that they had never demonstrated. As our consultation time came to an end, I found myself in the surreal position of scheduling follow-up appointments for my own mother, while listening to my parents plan how they would ask me for insurance coverage, all without either of them realizing that their daughter and their doctor were the same person. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, printing out her treatment timeline and medication information, "I want you to start taking these supplements immediately, and we'll begin your chemotherapy protocol next week. In the meantime, I strongly encourage you to ensure that your insurance situation is resolved as quickly as possible." "We'll contact our daughter this evening," my father said confidently. "I'm sure once we explain the situation, she'll take care of everything. She's always been responsible about family obligations." The irony was suffocating. They were planning to call me tonight to ask for insurance coverage, while sitting in my office receiving medical care from me, without having any idea that their responsible daughter and their caring physician were the same person. "I hope it works out," I said, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the emotional chaos brewing beneath the surface. Family support is crucial during cancer treatment, and it sounds like you have high expectations for how your daughter will respond. "Oh, she'll come through," my mother said with complete confidence. "She always does. That's just the kind of person she is." As I walked them to the door of my office, I found myself wondering how this evening's phone call would unfold. Would they recognize my voice? Would they make the connection between Dr. Sarah Chen and Sarah Thompson? Would they have any moment of self-reflection about the irony of asking for my help after abandoning me during my own health crisis? "Thank you so much, Dr. Chen," my mother said, taking my hand again as they prepared to leave. "You've given us hope, and you've made us feel like we're not alone in this fight." The gratitude in her voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt the complicated pull of family connection, despite everything that had happened between us. This was still my mother, still the woman who had raised me, and she was scared and vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. "You're welcome," I replied, my professional training overriding my personal hurt. "I'll see you next week to begin treatment." As they left my office, I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to feel the full impact of what had just occurred. In the space of an hour, I had provided comprehensive medical consultation to the parents who had abandoned me during my own cancer battle, listened to them plan how to ask me for insurance coverage, and scheduled ongoing treatment for my mother, all while maintaining complete professional composure. The phone on my desk would ring tonight, and my parents would ask Sarah Thompson for the help they were confident she would provide. They had no idea that Sarah Thompson and Dr. Sarah Chen were the same person, or that their request for assistance would be coming to the daughter whose own medical crisis they had deemed inconvenient and poorly timed. As I sat back down at my desk and pulled up my mother's treatment file, I realized that the next phase of this complicated situation was about to begin. Tonight's phone call would determine whether my parents had learned anything from their own experience with cancer, or whether they would continue to operate under the same selfish assumptions that had characterized their response to my diagnosis 3 years ago. The irony of the situation was perfect, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like the scales of justice might finally be balancing in my favor. The remainder of my afternoon passed in a blur of patient consultations and administrative meetings, but my mind kept drifting back to the surreal encounter with my parents. Every few minutes I found myself replaying moments from our conversation, analyzing their words and expressions for any hint of recognition, any flicker of memory about their own daughter's battle with cancer. By 6 o'clock, most of the medical center had emptied out, leaving behind the skeleton crew that maintained operations during evening hours. I remained in my office, ostensibly catching up on patient notes and treatment authorizations, but really just delaying the inevitable return to my apartment where I would wait for the phone call I knew was coming. My personal phone sat silent on my desk, its black screen reflecting the overhead lighting like a mirror of possibilities. I had changed my last name professionally after completing my residency, a decision I had told myself was about establishing my own identity in the medical field. Now I realized it had been about creating distance from a family that had proven themselves incapable of supporting me when I needed them most. Dr. Sarah Chen and Sarah Thompson existed in separate universes, until today when those universes had collided in the most unexpected way possible. My parents had sought out the best oncologists they could find, never imagining that their search for expert medical care would lead them directly back to the daughter they had abandoned 3 years ago. The irony extended beyond just their lack of recognition. During our consultation, I had provided them with the exact level of care and advocacy I had desperately wanted during my own diagnosis. I had listened to their fears with patience and compassion, explained complex medical information in terms they could understand, and assured them that their concerns would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. Everything I had done for them was everything they had failed to do for me. While I had faced surgery, chemotherapy, and recovery alone, constantly hearing about how my treatment schedule was interfering with wedding planning, they were now receiving comprehensive support from a medical team, led by the very person they had failed to support. My computer chimed with an incoming email, pulling me back to the present moment. The message was from Rebecca, my assistant, confirming tomorrow's schedule and noting that Mrs. Thompson had been added to my patient roster for ongoing treatment. Seeing my mother's name in my official patient list created another wave of cognitive dissonance. Linda Thompson, age 58, lung cancer stage 3, excellent prognosis with proper treatment and family support. The clinical description felt strange when applied to my own mother, reducing her to medical statistics and treatment protocols rather than the complex web of emotions and history that actually defined our relationship. I pulled up her treatment plan on my screen, reviewing the chemotherapy schedule one had designed specifically for her case. The protocol was aggressive but not punishing, carefully calibrated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing side effects. It was the kind of personalized care that required significant time and attention from both the medical team and the patient support system. 3 years ago, when I had been the patient, my parents had complained bitterly about the time commitment required for my treatment. They had questioned whether the chemotherapy schedule could be condensed or rearranged to better accommodate David's wedding timeline. They had suggested that perhaps I could delay certain treatments until after the festivities concluded. Now they were facing the same demands on their time and attention, the same disruption to their social calendar, the same need to prioritize medical care over convenience. The difference was that this time, they were receiving support and advocacy from someone who understood exactly what they were going through. My personal phone buzzed with a text message, causing my heart to skip several beats. But it was just a message from my colleague Dr. Martinez, asking about coverage for his patients over the weekend. I responded quickly, then returned to the waiting that was making my entire body feel tense with anticipation. At 7:15, my phone finally rang. The caller ID showed Dad, a contact I hadn't updated since before my diagnosis, when our relationship had still felt salvageable. I let it ring 3 times before answering, using the time to compose myself and prepare for a conversation that would test every ounce of professional training I possessed. "Hello? Sarah, honey, it's Dad. I hope we're not calling too late. Your mother and I have something very important to discuss with you." The sound of his voice, friendly and presumptuous in the way that assumed immediate availability and compliance, transported me back to dozens of similar phone calls over the years. The tone was exactly the same one he had used when calling to tell me that my surgery needed to be rescheduled to accommodate wedding planning. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and giving no indication that I already knew exactly what this conversation would entail. "Well, sweetheart, your mother has been diagnosed with cancer. Lung cancer, stage 3. We met with an amazing oncologist today, a real expert in the field, and she's going to need extensive treatment over the next several months." The way he presented the information, as if it were news to me, as if I hadn't spent an hour that afternoon designing my mother's treatment protocol, was surreal beyond description. But I played my part, responding with appropriate shock and concern. "Oh my God, Mom has cancer? When did you find out? How is she handling the news?" I could hear my mother's voice in the background, and my father relayed her response. "She's scared, obviously, but the doctor we saw today was very reassuring. Dr. Chen, that's her name, really knows her stuff. She explained everything clearly and made us feel like we're in good hands." The praise for my professional capabilities, delivered without any recognition that the competent physician they were describing was their own daughter, added another layer of irony to an already impossible situation. "That's good," I said carefully. "It's so important to have confidence in your medical team. What kind of treatment is she going to need?" 6 months of chemotherapy, possibly radiation, very intensive treatment. The doctor was very clear that Mom's health has to become the family's top priority. Everything else has to work around her treatment schedule. The repetition of my own words, delivered with complete sincerity by the man who had told me that my health would have to work around his social obligations, was almost more than I could process. But I maintained my composure and continued the conversation. Of course it does, I agreed. Cancer treatment should always be the priority. I'm sure the whole family will rally around Mom and make sure she gets everything she needs. Absolutely, my father said with conviction. We've already told David that everything revolves around your mother's treatment now. His vacation plans, work schedule, everything gets rearranged to support her recovery. The casual mention of David's expected sacrifices, delivered by the same man who had refused to ask David to adjust his wedding timeline for my surgery, created a moment of such pure irony that I had to grip my phone tighter to keep from dropping it. That's wonderful, I managed. Family support makes such a difference in treatment outcomes. Which brings us to why we're calling, my father continued, his tone shifting slightly to the more serious register he used when asking for favors. The treatment your mother needs is going to be very expensive, and our current insurance doesn't cover everything. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. I waited for him to continue, knowing exactly where this conversation was headed, but needing to hear him make the request that would complete the circle of irony. Your mother and I were hoping you might be able to help us out with insurance coverage. We know you have excellent benefits through your job, and we were wondering if there was any way you could add us to your plan, at least temporarily, until we get through this crisis. The request hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking about the conversation we had never had 3 years ago, when I had struggled to pay for my own treatment while they focused their financial resources on my brother's wedding expenses. Add you to my insurance plan? I repeated, as if I needed clarification about what they were asking. Just until Mom gets through treatment, my father said quickly, clearly interpreting my question as potential resistance. We know it would increase your premiums, and we'd be happy to reimburse you for any additional costs. We just need access to better coverage than what we currently have. The offer to reimburse me for additional costs was particularly ironic, given that they had never offered any financial assistance during my own treatment, despite knowing that I was struggling to cover expenses on a resident salary. This is a lot to think about, I said slowly, buying time to process the full implications of their request. Adding family members to an employer health plan is complicated. There are enrollment periods, eligibility requirements, financial implications. We understand it's a big ask, my mother's voice came through the phone as my father put me on speaker. But you're the only one in the family with the kind of insurance coverage that would really make a difference. We're desperate, Sarah. I'm scared, and we need to know that we can get the best possible treatment. Hearing my mother's voice, vulnerable and frightened in a way I had never experienced from her before, created an unexpected emotional complexity to the situation. Despite everything that had happened between us, she was still my mother, and the fear in her voice was genuine. I understand you're scared, I said gently, drawing on my professional experience counseling families through cancer diagnoses. Cancer is terrifying, especially when you're facing it for the first time. But there are options beyond adding you to my insurance plan. Have you looked into special enrollment periods, supplemental policies, or patient assistance programs? The doctor mentioned some of those options, my father replied. But frankly, we want the best coverage possible. This isn't the time to cut corners or accept second-rate care. We need to know that money isn't going to be a factor in any treatment decisions. The statement was remarkable in its unconscious hypocrisy. These were the same parents who had suggested that I consider less expensive treatment options to minimize the financial impact on the family budget, now insisting that money should never be a factor in medical decisions. Of course you want the best care possible, I agreed. Every cancer patient deserves that. But good insurance coverage doesn't automatically guarantee better medical outcomes. The quality of your medical team and the appropriateness of your treatment protocol matter much more than the source of payment. Still, my mother interjected, having comprehensive coverage would give us peace of mind. We'd know that we could afford whatever treatment Dr. Chen recommends without having to worry about cost. The mention of Dr. Chen, delivered without any recognition that she was speaking to Dr. Chen, added another surreal element to an already impossible conversation. Tell me more about this Dr. Chen, I said, curious to hear how they would describe me to myself. What's your impression of her? She's incredible, my mother said immediately, her voice warming with genuine enthusiasm. So knowledgeable and confident, but also very compassionate. She really listened to our concerns and made us feel like she understood how important this is to our family. She's exactly the kind of doctor you want when you're dealing with something this serious, my father added. No nonsense, but not cold either. She was very clear about what the treatment would involve and what we could expect. The praise was gratifying in a way that surprised me. Despite everything that had happened between us, hearing my parents' genuine appreciation for my professional capabilities felt meaningful. She sounds wonderful, I said. Did she mention anything about insurance requirements or financial assistance programs? She said most families rely on insurance coverage and family resources, my father replied. Which is exactly why we're calling you. We are family, and this is exactly the kind of situation where family members help each other out. The appeal to family loyalty, coming from people who had shown no loyalty to me during my own medical crisis, was breathtaking in its audacity. But it also revealed something important about how they viewed family obligations. In their minds, family help was something that flowed toward them, not something they were expected to provide to others. Family support is important, I agreed carefully, but it can take many forms. Emotional support, practical assistance, being present during treatments. Financial support is just one option. But it's the option we need right now, my father said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. Sarah, your mother is facing cancer. This isn't the time to be abstract about family obligations. We need concrete help, and you're in a position to provide it. The shift in his tone was familiar, the movement from request to expectation to demand that had characterized many of our interactions over the years. But this time I held the power in the relationship, and his demands carried no weight. I understand you're looking for concrete help, I replied, my voice remaining calm and measured. But adding family members to employer insurance plans isn't as simple as you might think. There are legal requirements, enrollment restrictions, and significant financial implications for the primary policyholder. What kind of implications? My mother asked, concern creeping into her voice. Well, family coverage typically costs significantly more than individual coverage. We're talking about potentially doubling or tripling my monthly premiums. Then there are deductibles, co-pays, out-of-pocket maximums. The financial responsibility doesn't end with just adding you to the plan. I was providing accurate information about insurance coverage, but I was also testing their response to the financial burden they would be placing on me. 3 years ago, they had been very concerned about the financial impact of my treatment on the family budget. I wanted to see if they would show the same concern for the impact on my budget. Of course, we'd reimburse you for any additional costs, my father said quickly, though his tone suggested he hadn't fully considered the financial implications until I mentioned them. We're talking about potentially thousands of dollars per month, I continued, plus whatever percentage of mom's treatment costs the insurance doesn't cover. Even with excellent coverage, cancer treatment generates substantial out-of-pocket expenses. There was a pause on the other end of the phone, and I could hear my parents having a whispered conversation that I couldn't quite make out. Sarah, my mother said finally, we understand this is a big financial commitment, but surely family is worth that kind of investment? When someone's life is on the line, don't you think family members should be willing to make sacrifices? The question was so perfectly ironic, so completely disconnected from their own behavior during my cancer treatment, that I had to take a moment to compose my response. I absolutely believe family members should be willing to make sacrifices when someone's life is on the line, I said slowly, letting each word carry its full weight. I believe families should prioritize health over convenience, medical needs over social events, and supporting their loved ones over maintaining their own comfort. Exactly, my father said, clearly interpreting my statement as agreement with their position. That's exactly the kind of family loyalty we're hoping to see from you. The question is, I continued, whether that loyalty has been reciprocal. Family support works best when it's based on a history of mutual care and concern. Another pause, longer this time, and I could sense their confusion about the direction of the conversation. What do you mean? My mother asked carefully. I mean that asking family members for significant sacrifices is easier when you've demonstrated a willingness to make similar sacrifices for them in the past. The statement hung in the air, and I waited to see if either of them would make the connection to their own behavior during my cancer treatment. But the silence suggested they either didn't remember or didn't see the parallel. Sarah, my father said slowly, if this is about money, if you're concerned about the financial burden, we can work something out. Maybe we could set up a payment plan or find other ways to offset the costs. It's not about money, I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. It's about understanding the full scope of what you're asking and making sure that everyone involved is committed to supporting each other through difficult times. Of course we're committed, my mother said, her voice rising slightly with emotion. This is about life and death, Sarah. This is about whether I get the treatment I need to survive cancer. The appeal to survival, the emphasis on life and death stakes, was particularly painful given that they had minimized those same stakes when I was the one facing cancer. But I maintained my professional composure and continued the conversation. I understand the stakes, I said gently. Cancer is terrifying, and treatment is challenging in ways that people don't fully understand until they experience it. The question is whether adding you to my insurance plan is really the best solution for your situation. What do you mean? My father asked. Well, have you explored all the other options available to you? Special enrollment periods for your current plan? Supplemental insurance policies? Patient assistance programs through the hospital or pharmaceutical companies? Sometimes families focus on one potential solution without fully investigating alternatives. It was a reasonable suggestion, delivered in the same tone I used with patients who were overwhelmed by insurance complications. But I was also testing whether they were interested in exploring options that didn't require sacrifice from me. We want to explore every option, my mother said, though her tone suggested she was humoring me rather than genuinely considering alternatives. But your insurance coverage would give us immediate access to the best care available. The insurance coverage I have access to, I corrected gently, is through my employer, and it comes with responsibilities and restrictions that might not be immediately obvious. What kind of restrictions? My father asked, his voice taking on the suspicious tone he used when he suspected someone was trying to avoid helping him. Well, for example, if I add family members to my plan and then leave my job or change positions, you'd lose coverage immediately. If my employer changes insurance providers, you'd be subject to whatever new restrictions or limitations come with the new plan. And if there are any complications with claims or coverage disputes, I'd be the one responsible for resolving them. These were all legitimate concerns about employer-sponsored insurance, but I was also creating obstacles that would require them to consider the complexity of what they were asking. We understand there would be some risk involved, my father said, though his tone suggested he was becoming impatient with the detailed discussion of logistics. But surely those risks are worth taking when someone's life is at stake. Perhaps, I replied, but there's another factor to consider. How would this arrangement affect our family relationship? Financial entanglements can create stress and resentment, especially when they're established during emotionally charged situations. What are you suggesting? My mother asked, and I could hear the first hint of uncertainty in her voice. I'm suggesting that we think carefully about the long-term implications of this arrangement. If I take on significant financial responsibility for your medical care, that creates a dynamic between us that might be difficult to navigate, especially if there are disagreements about treatment decisions or financial priorities. It was a diplomatic way of pointing out that our family relationship was already strained, though they seemed to have no awareness of that strain or its causes. Sarah, my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had used throughout my childhood when he wanted to end discussions that weren't going his way. I think you're overthinking this. Your mother has cancer. She needs the best possible treatment. You have insurance that can provide that treatment. This isn't complicated. The attempt to simplify the situation, to reduce it to a straightforward transaction that ignored all emotional and historical context, was exactly what I had expected. My parents had always been skilled at presenting their requests in ways that made refusals seem unreasonable or selfish. Family relationships are always complicated, I replied, especially when they involve significant financial commitments during medical crises. Are you saying you won't help us? My mother asked, and I could hear tears beginning to form in her voice. The question was designed to corner me, to force me into a position where I had to either agree to their request or explicitly refuse to help a cancer patient. It was emotional manipulation of the most sophisticated kind, And it was exactly the kind of pressure they had never been willing to accept when the roles were reversed. "I'm saying that I need time to think about this," I replied calmly. "Adding family members to my insurance plan is a significant decision that affects my financial security and professional obligations. I want to make sure I understand all the implications before making a commitment." "How much time?" my father asked immediately, clearly wanting to establish a timeline that would prevent me from indefinitely postponing a decision. "At least a few days," I said. "I need to review my insurance policy details, understand the enrollment requirements, and consider the financial impact on my own situation." It was a reasonable request, but I could sense their frustration with any delay in getting the answer they wanted. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her fear and desperation, "I'm starting treatment next week. We need to get the insurance situation resolved as quickly as possible." The urgency was genuine, but it was also being used as pressure to force a quick decision. They wanted my commitment before I had time to fully process what they were asking or consider the full range of alternatives available to them. "I understand the timeline is important," I said, "but making decisions about insurance coverage under pressure isn't wise for anyone involved. A few days to review the details thoroughly will benefit everyone in the long run." "Fine," my father said, though his tone suggested it wasn't fine at all. "But Sarah, I want you to understand how serious this situation is. Your mother's life could depend on getting access to the best possible treatment." The statement was designed to make me feel responsible for my mother's survival, to create emotional pressure that would override any practical concerns I might have about their request. It was manipulation disguised as information, and it was remarkably similar to the pressure tactics they had used when trying to convince me to reschedule my surgery. "I do understand how serious cancer is," I replied, drawing on my professional experience and personal history with the disease, which is exactly why decisions about treatment and insurance should be made thoughtfully rather than hastily. After we ended the call, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at my phone and processing the conversation that had just occurred. My parents had asked me to provide the financial support they had never offered, the family loyalty they had never demonstrated, and the sacrifice they had never been willing to make. They were expecting me to prioritize their medical needs over my financial security, to rearrange my professional obligations to accommodate their insurance requirements, and to take on significant personal risk to ensure their access to quality care. Everything they were asking me to do was everything they had refused to do for me 3 years ago. The parallels were perfect, down to the manipulation tactics and appeals to family obligation. The difference was that this time I held the power to say yes or no, and they were the ones in the vulnerable position of needing help from someone they had previously failed to support. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office, I realized that the next few days would determine not just whether I added my parents to my insurance plan, but whether our family relationship could survive the revelation of who Dr. Sarah Chen really was, and what that meant for their carefully constructed narrative about family loyalty and support. The irony of the situation was about to become even more complex, and I found myself both dreading and anticipating the moment when they would finally understand that their capable, responsible daughter and their expert, compassionate oncologist were the same person. Tomorrow would bring another day of treating my mother as a patient while she remained unaware of my identity, another day of providing the professional care they respected, while they continued to take for granted the personal relationship they had damaged. The balance of power had shifted completely, and for the first time in 3 years I felt like I might finally have the opportunity to address the hurt they had caused, on my terms and in my time. 3 days later, I walked into my office to find an urgent message from Rebecca waiting on my desk. My parents had called requesting an emergency consultation, claiming that my mother's condition had worsened, and they needed to accelerate her treatment timeline. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were now demanding immediate medical attention while still waiting for their daughter's decision about insurance coverage. I had spent the previous evening reviewing my mother's latest test results, which showed no deterioration in her condition. Her cancer staging remained unchanged, and there was no medical justification for altering our carefully planned treatment schedule. This emergency was likely more about increasing pressure on multiple fronts rather than any genuine medical crisis. The morning consultation had been scheduled for 10 o'clock, giving me just enough time to review their updated financial information and insurance documentation. What I discovered in their paperwork was illuminating. My parents weren't as financially desperate as they had initially portrayed. They had significant assets, including investment accounts and property holdings that could easily cover the cost of my mother's treatment. Their request for insurance coverage wasn't about financial necessity, it was about financial convenience. They wanted me to absorb the costs and complications of cancer treatment so they wouldn't have to liquidate investments or adjust their comfortable lifestyle. The same people who had expected me to handle the financial burden of my own treatment alone were now seeking to transfer their financial burden to me. When they arrived at my office, both parents appeared more agitated than they had during our first consultation. My father's usual commanding presence seemed diminished, while my mother looked exhausted in a way that suggested sleepless nights spent worrying about both her health and their financial strategy. "Dr. Chen," my father began before they had even taken their seats, "thank you for making time for us on such short notice. Linda's been having some symptoms that have us very concerned." I gestured for them to sit while maintaining my professional demeanor. "What kind of symptoms are you experiencing, Mrs. Thompson?" My mother's description of her symptoms was vague and inconsistent, the kind of minor discomforts that were normal for someone recently diagnosed with cancer, but not indicative of disease progression. As she spoke, I found myself wondering if they had convinced themselves these symptoms were serious, or if this was a calculated attempt to create urgency around their insurance situation. "These symptoms don't indicate any change in your condition," I explained after completing a brief examination. "What you're experiencing is consistent with the normal stress response to a cancer diagnosis. However, I am concerned about your overall stress levels, which can impact treatment effectiveness." My father leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's exactly what we're worried about, doctor. The stress of dealing with insurance complications is making everything worse. We're spending all our time fighting with insurance companies instead of focusing on Linda's recovery." The pivot to insurance issues was seamless, suggesting this conversation had been carefully planned rather than spontaneously prompted by medical concerns. "Insurance complications can certainly add stress to an already difficult situation," I agreed. "Have you made any progress on resolving your coverage issues?" "That's actually what we wanted to discuss with you," my mother said, her voice carrying a note of desperation that seemed more calculated than genuine. "We've been exploring all the options you mentioned, but we keep running into roadblocks and delays." My father pulled out a folder thick with paperwork. "We've applied for supplemental coverage, looked into patient assistance programs, even tried to upgrade our existing plan. Everything either requires waiting periods that extend beyond Linda's treatment timeline, or involves coverage limitations that would compromise her care." I reviewed their documentation, noting that they had indeed made some effort to explore alternatives. However, their applications and inquiries had been half-hearted, clearly designed more to demonstrate effort than to seriously pursue viable solutions. "I see you've been busy," I observed, setting their paperwork aside. However, I noticed that most of these applications were submitted only in the last few days. "Insurance processes typically require more time to develop than you've allowed." "Time we don't have," my father replied quickly. "Linda starts treatment next week, and we need to know that we have comprehensive coverage before we begin." The artificial urgency was designed to pressure me into making a quick decision about adding them to my insurance plan. They were creating a crisis timeline that made their preferred solution seem like the only viable option. "Actually," I said, pulling up my mother's treatment schedule on my computer, "we could delay the start of treatment by 2 weeks without compromising outcomes. That would give you additional time to secure appropriate insurance coverage through conventional channels." The suggestion clearly caught them off guard. My mother's face showed genuine alarm at the prospect of delaying treatment, while my father's expression shifted to barely contained irritation. "Doctor," my mother said quickly, "I really don't want to delay treatment. The sooner we start fighting this cancer, the better my chances of beating it." "I understand your eagerness to begin treatment," I replied, "but starting treatment with inadequate insurance coverage can create financial stress that actually impairs recovery. It's better to ensure you have proper support systems in place before beginning such an intensive protocol." My father's jaw tightened visibly. "We do have a support system in place, doctor. Our daughter has excellent insurance coverage, and we're confident she'll help us access the care Linda needs." The statement was delivered with such certainty that it was clear they had never seriously considered the possibility that I might refuse their request. In their minds, my compliance was a foregone conclusion, just as my accommodation to their wedding timeline had been 3 years ago. "You seem very confident about your daughter's response," I observed. "Has she already agreed to add you to her insurance plan?" My parents exchanged glances, and I could see the first cracks appearing in their confident facade. "We're still discussing the details," my mother said carefully, "but we're family. Family takes care of each other during medical crises." The statement hung in the air with bitter irony, coming from people who had demonstrated no understanding of family obligations during my own medical crisis. "Family dynamics can be complicated," I replied, "especially when previous experiences have tested those relationships. Has your family successfully navigated medical emergencies together in the past?" Again, the uncomfortable glance between my parents, followed by my father's dismissive wave. "This is our first serious medical emergency," he said, apparently forgetting that I had faced cancer just 3 years earlier. "But we're a close family. We support each other." The revision of family history was stunning in its completeness. They had erased my cancer experience so thoroughly from their consciousness that they genuinely believed this was their first encounter with serious illness. "I see," I said, making notes in my mother's file. "And your daughter, the one with the excellent insurance coverage, how do you think she'll respond to taking on the financial responsibility for your medical care?" "She'll step up," my father said with absolute confidence. "That's the kind of person she is. Responsible, reliable, committed to family. Even if it requires significant personal sacrifice on her part?" "Family is worth any sacrifice," my mother declared, apparently oblivious to the irony of her statement. I found myself studying their faces, looking for any sign of self-awareness, any indication that they recognized the contradiction between their current expectations and their past behavior. But there was nothing. They had rewritten history so completely that they genuinely believed they were a supportive, close-knit family, facing their first major crisis together. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, leaning back in my chair and assuming the direct tone I used when delivering difficult news to patients, "I need to share something with you that might impact your perspective on this situation." Both parents focused their attention on me with the intensity that medical professionals recognize as the moment when patients prepare to receive important information. "In my experience treating cancer patients," I continued, "family support is indeed crucial for positive outcomes. However, that support needs to be based on genuine commitment and mutual respect, not just convenience or obligation." My father's expression grew puzzled. "I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at, doctor. I'm suggesting that before you place such significant expectations on your daughter's willingness to help, you might want to consider whether your family has a history of providing the kind of support you're now requesting." "Of course we do," my mother said immediately. "We've always been there for each other." "Always?" I asked, allowing a note of skepticism to enter my voice. "Well, yes," my father replied, though his tone carried less certainty than before. "We're not perfect, but we're family." I opened my laptop and pulled up a file that had nothing to do with my mother's medical care, then turned the screen toward them. "I'd like to share something with you that might provide some perspective on family support during medical crises." The screen showed a photograph of me from 3 years ago, taken during my chemotherapy treatments. I was sitting in an infusion chair, bald from treatment, wearing the brave smile that cancer patients perfect for their family members. The photo had been taken by a nurse friend who understood that sometimes cancer patients need documentation of their strength for their own future reference. "This is a photograph of another patient I've worked with," I said, watching their faces carefully. "A young woman who faced cancer alone because her family considered her treatment timeline inconvenient." My mother studied the photograph with polite interest, while my father glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to me. "That's very sad," my mother said sympathetically. "I can't imagine facing cancer without family support." "Can't you?" I asked quietly, then reached across my desk and turned the photo frame that usually faced away from patients. The frame contained my medical degree, clearly displaying the name Dr. Sarah Chen, and next to it a small personal photo of me from my residency graduation. I watched as recognition began to dawn on my mother's face. Her eyes moved from the photograph on my computer screen to the graduation photo on my desk, then to my face, then back to the graduation photo. The progression of understanding was visible in her expression, moving from confusion to disbelief to slowly dawning horror. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My father followed her gaze to the photo on my desk, and I watched as the same recognition process played out on his features. The confident, demanding man who had walked into my office expecting immediate compliance slowly dissolved into someone who looked genuinely shocked. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Dad," I said quietly, my voice remaining professionally calm despite the emotional earthquake occurring in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, while my father sat frozen in his chair, staring at me as if I were an apparition that might disappear if he blinked too hard. "You're Dr. Chen," my mother said finally, her voice filled with disbelief. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," I confirmed. "Head of Oncology at Presbyterian Medical Center. Also your daughter, Sarah Thompson, the one whose cancer surgery you skipped because it conflicted with David's wedding." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and I watched as the full implications of the situation began to register with both parents. They had spent the last week praising my professional capabilities while simultaneously planning to exploit my financial resources, without having any idea that the competent physician and the reliable daughter were the same person. "Oh my God," my father whispered, his face draining of color. "Sarah, we had no idea." "Clearly," I replied. "Just like you had no idea that your daughter had built a successful medical career, while you were telling everyone that cancer treatment had made her distant and career-obsessed." My mother began to cry, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what had occurred. "Sarah, we didn't know. We never would have. If we had realized." "Realized what?" I asked. "That you were asking your daughter for help? The same daughter you abandoned during her own cancer treatment because it was inconveniently timed?" The accusations were delivered in the same calm, professional tone I used to explain treatment protocols to patients, but their impact was clearly devastating. My father looked as if he had been physically struck, while my mother's tears intensified. "We didn't abandon you," my father said weakly, though his voice carried no conviction. "Didn't you?" I opened another file on my computer and pulled up a timeline I had created for my own. Therapeutic processing. "Let me refresh your memory about the sequence of events 3 years ago." I read from the timeline with clinical precision. March 15th, I received my cancer diagnosis. March 20th, I called to inform you and request family support during treatment. March 22nd, you told me that my surgery, scheduled for April 10th, would conflict with David's wedding activities and suggested I reschedule. April 2nd, you called to confirm that you would not be attending my surgery because the bachelor party was that weekend. Each date was delivered like evidence in a court case, documenting their systematic abandonment during my medical crisis. April 8th, you asked me to consider postponing my chemotherapy until after the wedding so I could attend without feeling sick. April 15th, you sent a card to the hospital wishing me luck and explaining that you were too busy with wedding preparations to visit. My mother's sobs intensified with each revelation, while my father sat in stunned silence as I recounted their behavior with the same clinical detachment I used to discuss tumor markers and treatment protocols. May through October, 6 months of chemotherapy, attended by friends and colleagues but not family. November, you called to ask why I seemed distant, and suggested that perhaps cancer treatment had changed my personality. I closed the file and looked directly at both parents. "So yes, you abandoned me. Completely and systematically. You prioritized a party over your daughter's life, and now you're asking that same daughter to prioritize your life over her financial security." The parallels were undeniable, laid out with surgical precision that made any attempt at rationalization impossible. They had failed to provide the support they were now requesting, failed to make the sacrifices they were now expecting, and failed to demonstrate the family loyalty they were now demanding. "Sarah," my mother said through her tears, "we're so sorry. We had no idea how much we hurt you. We thought you understood that the wedding was important to David." "More important than my life?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air, unanswered because any response would be an admission of guilt that they weren't prepared to make. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "We made mistakes, Sarah. Terrible mistakes. But surely that doesn't mean we can't move forward as a family." "Move forward?" I repeated. "You mean move forward with you receiving the support you never provided, the advocacy you never offered, the sacrifice you never made?" "We can do better," my mother said desperately. "We can learn from our mistakes. We can be the family you needed us to be." "Can you?" I asked. "Because 3 days ago you called your daughter asking for a significant financial sacrifice, and when I suggested you explore other options, you became impatient and demanding. When I asked for time to consider the implications, you created artificial urgency to pressure me into compliance. You've demonstrated exactly the same behavior that characterized your response to my cancer diagnosis. The assessment was clinically accurate and personally devastating, even when facing their own medical crisis. Even when requesting help from someone they had previously abandoned, they had defaulted to the same selfish, manipulative patterns that had defined their parenting." "What do you want from us?" my father asked, his voice barely audible. "I want you to understand," I replied simply. "I want you to understand what it felt like to face cancer alone because your family considered your health less important than their social calendar. I want you to understand what it means to build a successful career while carrying the knowledge that your own parents viewed your medical crisis as an inconvenience." "We understand," my mother said quickly. "We understand now." "Do you?" I asked. "Because understanding would involve acknowledging that you failed me when I needed you most. It would involve taking responsibility for the damage you caused to our relationship. It would involve recognizing that your current request for help requires a level of family loyalty that you never demonstrated." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 3 years of unaddressed hurt and unacknowledged abandonment. "Sarah," my father said finally, "what happens now? With your mother's treatment, with our relationship, with everything?" I looked at both parents, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. They were smaller than I remembered, diminished by their own fear and the revelation of their hypocrisy. They were also my parents, flawed and selfish but genuinely frightened by the prospect of facing cancer without support. "Your treatment will continue as scheduled," I said, returning to my professional tone. "You're my patient now, Mom, and you'll receive the same level of care I provide to every cancer patient. My personal feelings won't interfere with your medical care." Relief flooded both their faces, though they clearly understood that medical care was only one aspect of their situation. "As for adding you to my insurance plan," I continued, "I've decided not to do that. You have other options available, and you have the financial resources to pursue them. You don't need my insurance coverage. You want it because it's convenient, and because you've always expected me to absorb costs and complications that you prefer not to handle yourself." "Sarah, please," my mother began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "This isn't about punishment," I said firmly. "This is about boundaries. Healthy families don't operate through financial manipulation and artificial urgency. They operate through mutual respect and genuine support." "What about our relationship?" my father asked. "Can we rebuild what we've damaged?" I considered the question carefully, drawing on both my professional experience counseling families and my personal journey through cancer and recovery. "That depends entirely on whether you're capable of genuine change," I replied. "Not promises of change, not temporary adjustments during crisis, but fundamental recognition of how you've operated as parents and family members." "We want to change," my mother said earnestly. "We want to do better." "Then start by taking responsibility for your own situation," I said. "Handle your insurance complications, manage your financial obligations, and support each other through this crisis the way you should have supported me through mine." "And if we do that?" my father asked. "Then maybe, eventually, we can begin rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect instead of one-sided expectation." As they prepared to leave my office, both parents looking shell-shocked by the revelations and their implications, my mother turned back to me with tears still streaming down her face. "Sarah, I know we have no right to ask this, but will you still be our doctor? Will you still take care of me? The question went to the heart of everything I had struggled with over the past week. Could I separate my professional obligations from my personal hurt? Could I provide compassionate care to someone who had shown me no compassion during my own medical crisis? Yes, I said finally. I'll take care of you. Not because you're my mother, but because you're my patient. Everyone deserves excellent medical care, regardless of their personal history. Thank you, she whispered. But understand this, I continued. In this office, I'm Dr. Chen, not your daughter. You'll receive professional medical care, not family accommodation. If you're looking for emotional support and personal advocacy, you'll need to find that elsewhere. As they left my office, I felt a profound sense of completion. The scales had finally balanced. The truth had been revealed. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like justice had been served. My parents would face their medical crisis with the same level of family support they had provided me, which was to say, very little. They would handle their insurance complications alone, manage their financial obligations independently, and navigate the emotional challenges of cancer treatment without the comprehensive family advocacy they had denied me. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. They had received exactly what they had given, no more and no less. And for the first time since my own diagnosis, I felt truly at peace with the choices I had made and the boundaries I had established. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.